Armstead. I didn't have a list of the folks who were going to be here when Armstead asked me to do this fairly recently. But this is really being a homecoming. And I was even looking at the list of panelists this afternoon, much less the folks on this morning. And it does go way, way back. One thing in particular, I don't know whether he's back with us or not, but I was kidding Haki about this during the lunch break. Next spring represents 40 years since I brought him as a young kid myself to Franklin College. We ran into each other. I took him to the Black Culture Center. He read 6 of my poems and asked me on the spot to be a part of the First Poets series. And what he said at the end of the break, I think has something to do with what I want to try to say in these next 25 minutes. I'll try to get us out of here by 3 since we got a late start. Is that unless you're talking about institutions, you're talking to the wind. I was saying to one of Armstead's colleagues, and we were laughing with each other over a fish sandwich at lunch, about all of the work that we've done for nothing and that some young folks just do not believe it. The Association for Black Culture Centers, which I formed in 1988, we had our first 20th conference at Maryland, and I've never been paid a cent for that work. But it's important, indispensable to movement. Dr. Mills called it the socialization is important. It's really, really important. So I'm really pleased to be here. I want to thank both Bart and Ann Armstead for inviting me. Very quickly, I want to give you just a little bit of my own way I come to this book. Back in the day, when the autobiography was one of 2 or 3 Bibles that we had, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth was another one, and because we weren't reading it right, that first book, Black Rage, that we, later deconstructed and came up with some different views about it. But those were seminal texts. So I won't go, given the time constraints, through the books. Many of them, most of them, were mentioned this morning. Certainly I remember reading John Henry Clark. I met him down at the University of Louisville at the Black Family Conference. Malcolm X, The Man in His Times. Or even Louis Lomax, When the Word is Given. Or Joe Wood, I think that title came up once this morning. Even Baldwin's play, One Day When I Was Lost. In addition to all the other texts and the films that were mentioned, including stuff by non-white authors. Certainly Goldman was mentioned this morning, Bruce Perry, Wolfenstein I think may have been mentioned, but all the work, whatever you think about it, I'm not taking judgment here, I'm really trying to raise some questions in this short period of 25 or so minutes. But the work that George Brightman did, everybody owning Malcolm, wanting a piece of Malcolm, was one of the arguments. So that was my way into Malcolm X. And what I did is I only found, since Armstead called me, maybe a dozen articles. I'm not even going to name them because I want to try to keep this concise and raise questions. 2 other quick preliminary things. My experiences with the Nation of Islam. I was born in the backward state of Indiana. I went to Terre Haute, Indiana when I was 10, and by the time I got into my 20s, there was a fairly viable mosque. The closest one was in Indianapolis, Indiana. And in the 70s, when I was an assistant professor at Wabash College, we had a community show on Channel 2 in Terre Haute, and it was called What It Is. We played Marvin Gaye's music, What's Going On, and then we had the film coverage of all the rich white folks over here, and the railroad tracks and us, etc., over there. But we brought 2 brothers from the Indianapolis Mosque in 2 weeks in a row. And white people in all of Vigo County called Channel 2, said, we've always known that that son of Reverend Hord was crazy, but we can't tolerate this kind of community show. You got to get rid of the show. And so they did. But we did know there were some brothers in Terre Haute who would make the distance, the travel to Indianapolis, who would sell the fish, who would move the newspapers. And what I saw, when I saw the sexism, I'm looking around me at a lot of other black nationalist organizations, and there was sexism almost everywhere at that point. So probably didn't bother me because it seemed to be so much in tune with what was happening and brothers being behind in that respect. I saw the recovery of life. People who had been to the state prison outside Terre Haute and who would come out and get their act together. I even remember when Etheridge Knight, the poet, spent a little time there. And I saw the discipline. And so the group, the group became something very, very, very important to me. In fact, to pull this preliminary part together, my encounter moment, as Bill Cross, the psychologist, calls it, was not really when Malcolm was assassinated. In 1965, I was old enough to anticipate that. I said they're going to come get him long before they ran me out of Indiana for being on Nixon's enemies list. I said they're going to get him. But what really became my encounter, not because I was as much in tune ideologically, was when they then wiped out King. Because as a boy, even as a teenager, we were always advised, don't be like Malcolm, be like Martin. And I said, these folks are playing games with me. Whatever the final real deal is. And it really shifted my thinking. And I think in many ways, Black Studies has saved my life. The man himself had a major influence on me as I became a man in years. Then it was his fearlessness and anger. Later, as I read his work and analysis of him, I was drawn, and still am, to his record of having no price, his ability to change, his evolution or metamorphosis rather than mask or reinventions, especially with respect to his views and practice of Islam, his centering of Africa as part of an international perspective, his shifting views of women, his focus on socialism, and his raising the prospect of black independent politics as the ballot alternative to the bullet. In my own work on Malcolm X, I introduced the autobiography to the Knox College Freshman Preceptorial in 1990, gave an annual lecture for a few years to its entire first-year class called The Triple Redemption of Malcolm X, and I'm going to try to weave briefly into this. And those lectures have become a chapter in progress into the sequel to the book, one of the books that Armstead mentioned, Reconstructing Memory, which again was published by Third World Press. The working title of the new book is The Human Metaphor, with an E dead in the center of human. Although I won't give much attention to sex and death in Malcolm's life, been raised briefly this morning, or even his conflicts with the Nation of Islam, as Marable does, certainly I think it deserves at least mentioning, and I'm thinking about what Salim had to say, what Marable thought about Haley, his past, why he wanted to do the book, what became considerations for the book, what was excluded, and probably given the date of the book, for a while, I'm as anxious as anybody to get my hands on those chapters that were again referred to this morning. Marable says, as I think Celine said it, Haley was a black Republican who most would have seen at ideological odds with Malcolm X. If you look at some of the pieces that Haley did on Malcolm before he began the joint work on the autobiography, they may be suggestive. His early piece, The Black Merchants of Hate, the Playboy interview, etc. Certainly, as Marable says, those critical silences in the autobiography on important parts of Malcolm X's life. And I think Brother Kelly said this morning, especially the Organization of Afro-American Unity. We still don't know very much at this point about that organization. You might be suggested here that Marable was not a revisionist in certain ways. That is, these are paraphrases of Marable's terms. He did not interpret Malcolm X through King. That is, through King, the integrationist liberal reformer. Although the King that I'm drawn to is the post-1965 King. The King that tells his colleagues when we're sitting around a tape recorder, turn off the tape recorder, I gotta tell you something. And he says, I'm a democratic socialist. And we don't talk about that. And some people still don't want to talk about that. Marable suggests that Haley may have been responsible for this revisionism. That is, from the angry black militant into a multicultural American icon. I think his language somewhere else is something like this. That some of us have made, what is he called? Malcolm, multicultural, and the rest of it, it'll come back to me, but it's a nice mix of some buzzwords that don't mean much to many of us anymore. And so finally with all of this, we get to Malcolm X, the postage stamp. Late 90s, almost 2000, 99 I think, and the X on Bill Clinton's cap. Marable. My work with Marable has not been like the work with Haki, but I do want to say just a couple of things about it, and then just look at 7 focuses of the work and wrap this up. I was reading Marable as far back as the 1970s when he published a book of essays called Blackwater, and have followed his work. I have been drawn to some changes that he made. I was drawn to his insisting that we look at class. I think 2 of the major mistakes that we, black men in particular, made in the late 60s and early 70s in these organizations in particular was we didn't take class seriously enough. We said we were talking about revolution. Malcolm would have said certainly we were at best talking about reform. And some of us were incurably sexist. And some of us has worked that out. But those are things that I think are very, very, very important. But Manning came to Knox for the 5th anniversary of the Association for Black Culture Centers. And I might forget it later. I tend not to think about what I'm doing in my work, but our 21st conference is at Wright State. This October 27th, you're all invited. I won't say more about that, right now. But let me just, he came to in 95. In 99 at Vanderbilt, I got in touch with him and he said, look, brother, he said, forget about the agents, deal with me personally and I will come to your conference at Vanderbilt in 1999 for expenses. And he did that, he presented, and he stayed for a couple of days. The last time I saw him, it's been a while. But he came to the conference in Raleigh, North Carolina in 2006. But as somebody else described him in a personal conversation today who had met him, to me, he really appeared personally like a down-to-earth brother who wasn't pretentious, that you didn't hear about all of his books and his degrees and stuff like that. And that's really where I'm going with when we get to the conclusion, because I think it's something that we really have to struggle with if we do what Dr. Murray suggested that we do this morning. I think we must, and that is find ways to make this discussion and however it's translated into something meaningful, for the children. So my own personal experiences with Marable when he was alive were positive ones. The works that he did, even with Leith Mullins, and I'm aware that she don't know much about her role as a Muslim, but I am aware that, at least I think she is a Muslim. But let's just look for 10 minutes at 7 of the emphases in Malcolm's book. Again, Marable's book, again, my aim is to raise questions. And one of the things I've liked about what I heard this morning, I don't think I heard very much of, I've got the final answers to all of these things. This is the only way you can read it. If you don't think about it this way, then you're probably seeing Marable incorrectly, or you're not understanding Malcolm X. One is, I think is very important, his discussion of human rights. But to use Haki's phraseology, we are talking again to the wind if we don't know something about human rights and have some of that in place before we get civil rights. Because if you're not clear about who you are as a human, civil rights can be just me getting mine, you getting yours, or what Stokely used to call, to at best, contributionist history. So this human rights thing, this emphasis on human rights, I think was very, very important and really hit a number of us when we started hearing about it from Malcolm, kind of as a precondition for negotiating civil rights. The radical humanism that Marable talks about that comes out of that. 2, Africa. Blacks being African, that famous speech he did at Michigan State, 1963, rather than Asiatic. His ongoing emphasis, however he mixes it with class, on Pan-Africanism. The need for cultural roots. Some people have been very disturbed that Malcolm can be said to have said that our culture was decimated to the point almost destroyed. And people say he's overstated the case, they didn't get all of us, and we're still pretty clear about some of these things. But the whole business, the need for cultural roots, or as he said regarding Africa, returning to Africa philosophically and culturally. His prediction at the end, again, this is, I think, at least a fair translation of Marable, that color won't be central to future conflicts. And I wish there were time to tease that out. Maybe there will be in the question and answer period. Number 3 of the 7, colonialism. Malcolm was early not only talking about European colonialism, but was referring to this country, USA, as a colonialist country. And one of the early informers of much of my work that uses a framework of internal colonialism, a focus on institutions, being dominated by institutions, and therefore, again, back to Madhubuti, having no recourse if we're to survive, much less prosper, but to build and sustain our own institutions. Colonialism, the structural, again, thinking about, among others, what Dr. Mills said this morning, the structural causes. If there are structural causes, then necessarily, one might argue, structural solutions. And perhaps as important as anything, at least as I see it, has to do with, and it's the hardest course for me to teach at Knox College. Every other year I teach a course in African American psychology. The psychological entrapments that come out of being dominated. Just a quick spin, and I want to still have us out of here, at least within that half an hour that I was told I had. One of the most painful parts of this journey for me has been, and I've talked to other people about it, some of the baddest people, Sonia Sanchez is bad, in the world, the nationalists, super nationalists, and getting close to some of them has been very disconcerting. African names, African symbols, African garments, American views, European culture, me and mine, you if I can fit it in, and it's comfortable. That has scared me, maybe a little bit less at this point of the service, but it is something I think we have to wrestle with if this is going to have any meaning as we translate it for the young. Socialism. One clear thing, I'm almost quoting Marable here, is probably the quickest way to do it. The Black freedom movement, I know I'm not talking to anybody in here, must reject the private enterprise system. I often say to students in the classroom, and some of you can probably finish the rest of this statement, when Malcolm said, you show me a capitalist, I'll show you a vulture. Yet, he continued to emphasize black economic power or black economic progress. Last three. Really, the first is self-explanatory. I don't need much time, but I do think it's something that bears mentioning. Integration and separation are both just methods to an end in terms of how we get from here to there. And so much could be said about that that I won't try, again, to tease that out anymore. The vote, independent politics. I often wonder when I think about the convention that was held not too far from here in '72. And as I look at the shift, somebody from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was making a comment this morning, of the 60s, the early 70s, the independent politics that Malcolm seemed to be talking about, and its influence on the emphasis on electoral politics. I think all the way back, I don't know the guy, but a book written probably about the time I came into this phase, hope I don't screw it up, Henry Moon, called The Balance of Power. He was an official for the NAACP. The book was written in the late 40s. I don't think that's what Malcolm was talking about. But if you saw any possibilities other than the bullet, that the ballot would have, several things would have to be true regarding the ballot. And then the final thing, to me as important as anything about Malcolm, unfortunately not much here, is his shift regarding women and his views of women. And let me just use one illustration before leading into the conclusion. Marable says that there were people in the Organization of Afro-American Unity that were unhappy with Malcolm's view that the women in that second organization, after the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, that they should have equal rights. And because they came out of the NOI, or subsequent to that were members of the Muslim Mosque, that they had some problems with that. Conclusion. Reinventions. Salim says, I really don't think he meant anything terrible about it. Probably meant agency. But as we look at that title, part of the title of that text, I think these other terms that I mentioned earlier, one that came out of this morning, are important at least to think about. The evolution that I've mentioned, metamorphosis that I've mentioned, and one person this morning used the word transformation, which may be another way to look at what was happening to him. Let me end with this. I think our greatest struggle as black people, with all of our new titles and new jobs and new homes and all of that stuff, is to find another way to live with ourselves without succumbing to the culture. And now I mean culture, big C. Culture as a way of life. I ain't talking about arts and religion. And when I look at the college graduates in particular, the name brand intellectuals again, something deep and injurious has happened to so many of us. Old people just say it's gotten good to us. That by the time you're in the presence of some people, nobody in this room obviously, for 5 minutes, you could write their biographies. I do not think this is what our enslaved ancestors meant long term, when they did certain things or didn't do certain things and looked ahead to our coming, that it was this kind of person that they had in mind, who would work against each other, who had your own price, to whom things were the most important. And I'm back again to what drew me to Malcolm as a young person.